of regulatory. And Utility API, we're a software company that actually provides access to data for third parties at customers' election. And we do that working directly with utilities. But I actually came from the Colorado PUC about 4 months ago. I was an advisor to the commissioners there, and data access has been a topic at the Colorado PUC on and off since 2009. So we've had a lot of lessons learned in the process, and I'll be providing some kind of foundation before we move into more of the use cases here. And next. So the first webinar, we talked about the opportunities that were created by data sharing, and today we're mostly going to be focusing on situations where customer consent is required. So the customers explicitly agreeing their data can go to another person or another entity. And the types of data we're talking about are energy usage data, maybe account data, maybe information about participation in a certain program like net metering. But one thing I think is important is to think not just about the types of data that are shared, but how customers are wanting to share it to achieve all of these kinds of goals. There are people who will go into their web portal, download their data, and analyze it. And I've done it, probably some of you on the call have done it, but I think that's not how the majority of people are doing it. They aren't deeply studying their own data in spreadsheets. What they're doing instead is they're sharing it with other platforms that conduct an analysis and help them with the next steps, right? So they're sharing their data with a smart thermostat company that will then help adjust house temperatures automatically based on their preferences. And so I think it's important to understand that the utility customer themselves, they may not be tech savvy, they may not be interested in the details or the types of data that they're sharing, but they want an approach that's going to work to get them an answer so that they can select a contractor. Next. But with that, what's the reality of what customers face is it's different tools, different portals, different programs, different enrollment pathways. Some customers have more ability to access and share their data just because by virtue of the state they live in than others do. And some of the approaches for data sharing that exists are easier for a third party like an electric vehicle company or a storage company to put into their workflow and actually make work. And next. Um, and so in the middle of all of this, there are, you know, there's still companies that want energy data. There are customers who want to share that. And so a lot of different approaches have arisen over the years to kind of find workarounds to ensure that customers are able to share data. So I'll talk about four common approaches, although these aren't the only ones. The most common or a very common approach is just email credential sharing. A customer will send an email with a copy of their bill PDF to a third party, or they'll share their utility account credentials, which is less than ideal. Another approach is letters of authorization. So this is an example of a PDF that can be filled out and mailed to a utility representative. I was many years ago working for a local government that had Recovery Act funding, and so we were basically to verify the results of energy audits, we had to get customers to fill out paper forms. That is an example that's fairly manual. It's usually transacted by email. It may not be secure. So again, not necessarily ideal. Um, Third approach is an authorized web portal adapter with the utility. So the customer can enter their credentials, like a login to the utility's website, and that gives the service provider an access to basically copy data out of their account. And so, less manual, certainly faster than other options, but might be inefficient, can be kind of hard to maintain when you're doing an adapter approach. And then that leads us to the fourth option. This is an example from Eversource. And this is a digital platform, digital authorization approach where the service provider can connect with the utility's data vendor or the utility through an API, which is like a software intermediary. It basically says what kinds of data can get exchanged between entities. And then the third party can pull specific data in a secure channel after the customer's authorized it. And moving on to the next slide, that's the one I want to dig into just a little bit. This isn't the only way to do a data exchange. There are going to be service providers who are working with customers who don't have internet access or a smartphone access, for example. But I think this is going to be a major emerging tool that you're going to be seeing a lot more examples of in cases, because it's the kind of thing that a majority of utility customers will be able to use. And just to provide a little bit more grounding on kind of how this works, what it's like to have digital authorization for your energy data sharing. Think about just a time you've given access to Zoom to set up a calendar appointment in your Google Calendar for a webinar. Or if you've ever, like me, purchased something from eBay, but you pay for it using PayPal. So this is a really mainstream process of connecting applications through a common authorization process. And there are two features of this I wanted to just flag that are really important from a customer's perspective. One is just having a really clear consent process. The customer should know what data is being shared, with whom, for how long, and they should have an ability to revoke that. And then the authorization itself should be straightforward. Like if you use the letter of authorization, like on the prior slide, it might require a customer account number. That's not always something that customers have easy access to. They can't find it quickly. They tend to drop out in the process when they can't find information fast. Um, and so a more efficient approach for that is to draw from other industries. You know, how many times a day do you get texted or emailed a passcode to log on to something? It's not my favorite thing to do, but it is a secure way of ensuring that you're getting to the right person here. And that is a technique that we can use in energy data sharing as well as in other industries. And next slide. Um, so in addition to these customer experience features, there are a couple of best practices from the software industry in general that really make this work. And I won't go into a ton of detail. We can take this to questions if you all want, but one is using data standards. In this field, that is the Green Button standard and specifically Green Button Connect, which enables the creation of structured data sets, which are really important because they can be standard across utilities. They can be used to support large quantities of data, and a higher quality implementation of digital authorization is going to include not just the features we talked about, but also data standards. And I think if I had just one takeaway from this over the years that I've been doing it, it's that the standard is absolutely foundational, but it is one factor of many that makes this work. Um, a second feature from software industry best practices is just security by design, having embedded data sharing protocols. So I'm citing to OAuth 2.0. I'm not going to represent myself as the most technical person in the world here, but I think what this does is, if you use the example like eBay and PayPal, this is the connection point between these applications. It's an industry standard. It allows the sharing of data in certain parameters. And a final feature is identity management, which is basically saying, it's the difference between being a website user and a website administrator. Depending on the purpose in which you're engaged, you can vary the level of access that an entity should have. And so that's can be really important for working with third parties. You can have a solar company with a main administrator and they can easily onboard and offboard staff once they're approved. That's the kind of thing that makes this a lot more efficient. Next. Um, but there's a flip side to all of these things that I've been talking about that make things easier, which is the things that create friction. Um, and there are several of them. I mean, certain implementations we've seen create hurdles for third parties, long review processes, inability to add staff, really bespoke and aggressive terms and conditions is something that we're increasingly seeing, treating a third party like they're basically a bolt-on vendor to the utility, as opposed to a separate entity that's getting information in one direction. We see processes that are confusing for the customer too. They're multi-steps, the information's hidden, they can't figure out how to authorize. The consent process might not be clear. I think a big one I've seen is the customer can't always follow the chain to figure out how to revoke consent from a third party once it's shared. We think that's important for the customer having control over the life cycle of the process. Um, Manual processes create really long lag times. If you think about if you're an implementer who is sitting with a customer in person, they've signed off the paper consent form, you have gotten a lot of the enrollment processed. The paper consent form goes into the utility, and 2 weeks later, you hear that the account numbers were transposed, and so the paperwork needs to be redone. Requires new meetings with all the different, challenges those create for meeting up with people. It creates friction for the customer as well as the third party. And then you can have incomplete data sets. The third party, if a solar and storage company is looking for particular data in order to put together a proposal and they're only getting half of what they need through digital authorization, that can be a problem. It doesn't make it the process more efficient. So, something I think we've seen over the years is that these data sharing implementations, they're not getting a lot of usage. I think it might be because one or more of these factors isn't coming together. It's not that there is an appetite, it's that is friction in the process. And so I really encourage you to test any data tools you have, not just as a customer, but also try to demo them as a third party if you can, to kind of understand where those friction points are. And I'll just leave you on a final point, which is an example of a really smooth authorization experience. This is something we think is really positive and a good step forward. It's not a project we're involved in, but this is a pilot that Pacific Gas and Electric has been doing with Apple Home application. And there's a little bit of public information about it. You can find press releases and some conference information, but this is basically creating the ability to connect with your PG&E app, account through your Apple Home app, and use that for energy management. It's clear, it's easy, it gets the job done. And this is the kind of thing that I think will really make data authorization and data sharing take off, and make a customer's data much more used and useful for them. So thank you very much for your time.
Hi everybody, my name is Simon Evans and I am a director here in Arup, and I'm going to talk to you briefly about some of the work that we've been doing within the UK called the Data Sharing Infrastructure, or previously referred to as the Digital Spine, which builds really nicely on what Kelly was referring to there, how we can enable data to be shared ubiquitously and frictionlessly across the energy sector. Next slide, if I may. So in the UK, we've had a myriad of policies and publications over nearly the last decade asking for better data sharing to happen across the entire sector, particularly to address sector level challenges, operational challenges, planning challenges, whatever it might be. And this picture here really lays out some of those key things that have come up over that timeline, really starting on the left-hand side by some really inspirational cross-sector activities that were happening at the time, particularly something called open banking, which back in 2019 was only 1 year old, and since then has been credited at creating the fintech economy for us here in the UK. And as we went through this journey, you can see on the slide here, much of the sector was asking for this idea of better data sharing, which of course, as Kelly was saying in her various options, is not about emailing PDFs and Excel files to each other. It's about that machine-to-machine integration across the system. And in around 2023, our government at the time kind of started to take note of all the activities that were happening and put forward a request to develop a bit more detail around what this concept was, how we could start to do it, and how a roadmap of implementation would be developed. Now, we as Arup were deeply involved in that piece of work, and since 2023 have been supporting the implementation of this. And over the next couple of slides, I'm going to briefly tell you kind of the background to what was introduced in 2023 and also the progress by which we've kind of moved since then. Next slide, if I may. But to really set the scene of the needs case of why, of course, we're all from energy, but just to kind of play it out, in our research that we did, it became clear that pretty much any objective a sector has, net zero being an example here, requires you to integrate the energy system. And that integrated energy system at a level of integration we've never seen before will require you to model a range of scenarios. Those scenarios will vary from, how would the market respond in certain situations? What does it look like when we have the introduction of new energy vectors, maybe rooftop solar, for example? And the modeling of those range of scenarios requires you to be able to have visibility of the system behavior, which becomes even harder when we have the introduction of distributed energy resources. And to get that visibility of system behavior, intrinsically, you require a method of data sharing between participants, whoever those participants are in the sector. And that method has to be secure, resilient, and scalable to cater for the variety of data sets that we have across the sector and the variety of participants. Now, of course, that data sharing, or more commonly referred to as interoperability between participants, is something that is in need of both a socio and a technical approach. And when I say socio-technical, the technical side, of course, is the aspects most people focus on, the models, the taxonomies, the ontologies, the hardware, the software, which of course is really important. But the key thing actually is not that. It's the socio side, which is the policy, the regulatory, the legal, the skills, the procurement, that is going to be the real part that we need to address. And as you've seen from how this diagram has completed itself already, if you kind of follow the circle round, you can draw quite a clear line of sight between interoperability and achieving targets such as net zero or clean power or whatever your jurisdiction's target is. And we have strong conviction from the work we've been doing here in the UK and also conversations we've been having with international jurisdictions that there is that real realization that the role of interoperability, semantic interoperability at its core, has a key activity or as a key part in allowing data as an economic enabler to support in the journey of the future. Next slide, please. So we took all this thinking together, and the conclusion of our piece of work was that data sharing is crucial in achieving net zero at the lowest cost of consumer. And how do we do that? Well, that's really summarized by these 5 points here. How can we introduce the minimum, so the thinnest possible solution that will be socio and technical in nature, that reduces the cost, friction, and barriers to data sharing, that is secure, resilient, and scalable, which allows you to share any energy sector data between any energy sector participants. So the scope of this is all participants, all data, but do so in a secure way, a trusted way, that only the right people see the right things at the right time. Now, this, of course, will accelerate trust, semantic interoperability, but also the realization that energy, we're not an island. Our data is intrinsically useful for adjacent sectors such as telecommunications, water, transport. And how can we enable that seamless transfer of data from our sector to theirs and back again to enable sector level or economy level use cases, ultimately enabling better outcomes for society, the environment, and of course, the economy. Now, we went through this activity as Arup, supported by an academic institution called the University of Bath and a quasi-government accelerator called the Energy Systems Catapult. Extensive engagement across the sector, which really set the foundation of why this has now become a solution that's been built, which I can touch on in a few slides. Next, please. But when I say data sharing infrastructure, what do I actually mean? Well, simplistically, it has these 3 components: prepare, trust, and share. To explain what they are and why we've taken these 3 components, it's really because the realization was whenever you have these conversations with people, it quite quickly can devolve into a level of technical detail that's unhelpful for what you're trying to communicate. But if I talk to you and explain these 3 parts in order, so next, if I could. The prepare aspect is that any organization, any participant in this sector can deploy the same open source containerized piece of technology at their organizational boundary. Now, this broadly provides a window into the shared ecosystem. It's thin, it's lightweight, it's open source, and therefore can't be subject to commercial activities and or commercial vendors, and allows anyone to partake. Next, if you could. At the center of the system, we have what we refer to as the data sharing mechanism, which is really the control plane or broker. It provides that authorization and authentication that transactions and participants are valid, but really importantly, no data is ever stored in the middle and no data passes through the middle. So to be clear, this is not a giant data store. It is purely a broker that allows connectivity between various participants. Now, also within this data sharing mechanism, next slide, please. We have the most important part called the trust framework, as we refer to it, which is taken from inspiration of the open banking work in consumer finance, but really provides some core functionality that is intrinsic to this being successful. The first is it provides, of course, some identity management framework, so some simple KYC, know your customer checks, identifying and validating that this entity is who they say they are still who they say they are, and various kind of automations around that space. But the most important part is it allows you to address the key challenge when it comes to data sharing across multiple participants. And this frankly, is the fact that in data transactions today, there needs to be some type of contract or agreement that is put in place between two participants when they share data. So, for example, participant A and participant B, they want to share data around a purpose. They need to agree some type of contract for that purpose. Now, if they want to expand the purpose or change the purpose, they typically require a new contract to be put in place. Now, that is quite cumbersome and also introduces a bilateral nature to the number of connections in a network, which, from a mathematical point of view, is referred to the handshake problem, nearly an n-squared relationship, which means that if you look at these four participants here, for them to exchange data bilaterally, there's 16 connections. So as you scale this up across an entire sector, across an entire country and an economy, it becomes crippling when you try and use the same construct to share data between people. So the trust framework provides that scalable legal framework to address exactly that. Now, to explain how this works in practice, next slide, please. If we take two participants, A and B, both of them would register or deploy a node at their organizational boundary. Again, it's open source, it's free to use, it's easy to use, and it's a window into the shared ecosystem. They both register with the data sharing mechanism that accredits them, provides that kind of enlisting into the trust framework. And then if organization A wants any data across the entire sector, they can search for it within the data catalog, the metadata catalog that exists within the central red part. Now, if they find the data, which they might see based on who they are and who they are in that organization, so for example, a system planner will see different information than a network operator, and it's kind of scaled proportionally, so the permissions are relevant to who you are and who in the organization you are. Then they can request the data, and that authorization and authentication request is put through. And if the transaction is valid, then the data can be shared between the two participants in a federated, secure channel. And this, of course, can scale up between any participants. Now, this, of course, is some great pictures and really easy to talk about, but the key activity that's happened over the last 18 months or so is this has moved from theory and concept, very much modeled off data mesh concepts and successes of open banking, and has now been implemented within the UK, within a select group of transmission, distribution, and system operators. And that phase is finished a couple of months ago, was wildly successful, and was led by our system operator. We have one system operator across the entire UK called National Energy System Operator. And then I'll start in their next phase, where they're going to be rolling that out to pretty much every participant who's regulated within our country, which is a huge number of people. But it also provides the critical mass that could be created to allow the system to flourish going forward. Now, we're really excited about this work, and there's many parallels to some of the stuff that my colleagues will speak about today. I think the key thing to leave you with is this is about sharing any energy data to any energy sector participant. But really, it's about making all data shareable, not necessarily all data shared. So don't think I'm telling you that all data will be open to all people. That would be lunacy. It's about data being shared securely and resiliently to the right participants with the right permissions, but providing the same common digital, technological, and contractual mechanism by which it can be done, so that the level of effort spent by participants in delivering their use cases can be on the use cases instead, rather than focusing on the core infrastructure that really is just moving data from A to B. Thank you very much. That's all from me.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Adrianne Bletz, and I'm an energy policy analyst with the New York State Department of Public Service. Today, I'm going to talk about enabling useful access to useful data to support our clean energy goals, spur market innovation, and promote customer choice. To set the stage, let's start with what we mean by useful access to useful data and how New York has structured this process. The Data Access Framework, or DAF, is New York's single statewide set of rules for energy-related data access. It's meant to be a consistent, transparent system that works the same way for everyone, whether you're a utility, a third-party provider, or a customer deciding to share your own data. DAF applies to all energy service entities, or ESEs, that are requesting either customer data or system data from a data custodian. If you're seeking access, you fall under these rules. DAF defines cybersecurity and privacy requirements based on three different things: whether the request is for consented or unconsented data, the mechanism by which you're seeking to access that data. This could be through a direct connection to a utility system, a secure or public platform or portal, or through email or other non-electronic connections. The third item is the type of data being requested. This could be system, customer level data, and it could be interval usage data, aggregated data, or another data category. The framework also sets clear responsibilities for what we call the data custodian, which is usually the utility. In New York, we actually have a integrated energy data resource as well, so it's a centralized data warehouse. They're also considered a data custodian under the DAF requirements. So now for the data custodian, we need to ensure there's data quality, integrity, and to make sure information is delivered in a timely way. Importantly, it supports a customer's right to access and share their own data, which is a central part of the framework. We want customers to be empowered to make informed decisions and to share their information when it benefits them. For example, if a residential customer wants to share their interval usage data with a solar developer, the framework makes sure that there's a secure, standardized process for doing that and that the customer's privacy and rights are protected. That's the big picture foundation. Now let's look at what happens when customer consent hasn't been obtained. Even without individual customer opt-in, there are certain cases where data sharing is not only allowed but necessary. We refer to this as having a valid purpose for access to unconsented data. Some of these valid purposes can include opt-out programs like community choice aggregation, building benchmarking, compliance with local laws, energy planning initiatives, commission authorized programs like implementing an energy efficiency program, or for in support of utility operational needs. Privacy protections are mandatory for the use cases, with the primary protections being aggregation, anonymization, and the application of applicable privacy screens. So aggregation means combining data from multiple customers so that no single person's information can be identified. This is typically done to identify energy usage totals at a building or community level. Anonymization removes all personally identifying details. This would be things like names, addresses, and account numbers. This makes it impossible, or at least highly impractical, to link the data back to a specific customer. This is primarily achieved through aggregation of the data or by keeping customer level data by identifying it with an alternative ID like a proxy ID instead of the specific customer information. Privacy screens are rules or filters built into the data release process to ensure that even after aggregation or anonymization, no identifying details slip through. So in New York, we have a standard statewide 4x50 privacy screen. That means at least 4 customers must be in the data set, and no one customer can represent more than 50% of the total usage. It's a balancing act. We have to make sure the protections are restrictive. If they are too restrictive, the data can become less useful for planning and innovation. But if we make them too loose, we then jeopardize the customer's privacy and put it at risk. So whether or not consent is obtained, the framework provides guardrails to make sure data is handled responsibly. But when regulators review proposals for data access, there are deeper questions to ask, and that's where we're going to next. So these are some of the key questions regulators can ask to strike the balance between enabling innovation and protecting customers. So how will privacy and security be verified and maintained? Protection can't be a one-time box to check at launch. Threats change quickly, so there needs to be ongoing monitoring. Things like periodic audits, required certifications, and well-defined breach response plans. How will utility implementations be standardized? Without standardization, we risk creating a patchwork of rules and implementations that vary from utility to utility. That drives up costs, slows down innovation, and makes it harder for both utilities and third parties to work effectively. How will usability and timeliness be ensured? Even if the system meets all technical requirements, it's not delivering value if the data arrives too late to act on. Timely data is essential for things like demand response, real-time energy management, or targeted program delivery. Are aggregation and anonymization methods sufficient? So right now we have a 4x50 rule, which is considered sufficient protection. But as technology advances, so does the ability to re-identify people from supposedly anonymous data sets. Regulators should revisit these methods periodically to confirm they're still doing the job. What oversight exists for energy service entities once they have the data? The responsibility for protecting the data doesn't stop when it leaves the utility's hands. There needs to be clear accountability and consequences for misuse. What is the process for customer consent and revocation? Customers should be able to give consent easily in plain language, and they should be able to revoke it just as easily. Trust in the system depends on that flexibility. By asking these questions, regulators can make sure data access works in practice, not just in paper. And more importantly, they can help ensure that while we enable innovation and support the clean energy transition, we also are protecting the privacy rights and trust of the customers we serve. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Nina Suetake, and I am the Deputy Director of Policy for the National Association of State Utility Consumer Advocates. And I will be speaking to concerns of the consumer advocates about customer data sharing. And thankfully, a lot of my concerns overlap with the issues that Adrianne just raised in her presentation. And all of these concerns can be considered questions to ask in a rulemaking, or if a utility asks to share data, or if you're developing your own state framework for data sharing. And none of these concerns are insurmountable, but commissioners do need to be thinking about these as they set up a way forward with data sharing in their states. And as many of the speakers already talked about, the first part is getting explicit consent from consumers. And from NASUCA's viewpoint, privacy should be the default as the base sort of standard for when we start talking about data sharing. And then the question becomes, do you consent by saying yes, or or by saying no, or opt in versus opt out? And if you're talking about data sharing for a program, then it becomes a question of, are you talking about an opt-in or opt-out program? And you can either talk about sharing data privacy or privacy of data for sharing purposes as in its own standalone issue, or as part of program development. And these concerns are the same as if you do it standalone or as part of program development. But again, as NASUCA supports a framework that by default, consumers should not have to take action in order to protect their privacy. And if there is an opt-out program that is developed by a state, they really need to think about all of these steps as part of an opt-out program. So the first thing that I would think about when talking about this in terms of a rulemaking is how are utilities and or third parties obtaining consent? You need specific affirmative consent from the consumer after receipt of the complete information about the proposed data sharing. I will get to that when I talked about scope of data sharing. So, the old gold standard for obtaining consent would be written signed consent, but I recognize that there are different models for interacting with customers now. And Kelly walked us through a digital authorization process, and I appreciate the protections that were included in that process that she presented for us. However, as we move to a more digital world, I would posit, who are you trying to get? Are you trying to get as many customers onto your program or into your demand response program as you can possibly, or are you only trying to target the customers that can walk through a digital authorization process? And if you provide all customers information about, demand response or, TOU rates or other ways that they could possibly save money, are you leaving customers out by only using a digital process? So those are some questions I would ask. If you do want to target your entire customer base, then you really need to think about your target demographics and whether or not you're meeting them where they are and how they communicate. Because I'm the child of immigrants. Despite being here for 50 years, they do not trust their English, and they definitely, as 80-year-olds, do not trust their ability to navigate digital processes. And so they will come to me with every single thing that a utility sends them, they will ask me to help them with. And they are lucky enough that their daughters are willing to help them with this, but it's probably not the case for all consumers. So in addition to language barriers that you have to think about if you want to get as many customers as possible on your programs, you also have to ask, is this process working for everybody? I know from my own personal experience with my parents, they think that communications from a utility is really important. They're not going to necessarily assume that it's optional. So that has to be very, very clear at the outset that their consent is optional for these programs. Or if you're looking at opt-out, it has to be very, very clear at the very top that they need to do this. They need to do something to opt out. And that has to be, because of language barriers, provided in multiple languages in your service territory. And then that moves to the scope of consent and retracting consent. And as I said, before obtaining consent, utilities must clearly inform their customers about what information will be shared, how that information will be used, and to whom the information will be disclosed. And then utilities must have a really clear understanding of what steps are necessary for customers to retract their consent. And in a framework where vendors and utilities are able to get consent and customers need to retract their consent, it has to be very clear who the customer talks to retract that consent. If your framework leaves it that the vendor is responsible for shutting down their data sharing, then the utilities have to understand that process as well, because customers are not by default going to go to a third-party vendor. Even if they're informed of their name, they're going to go to their utility because they're always going to be looking at the utility as controlling their data, their energy usage. And so it's necessary for both utilities and the vendor to understand that process and be able to share it with customers whenever a customer asks them to retract their consent. And that shifts to responsibilities of third parties. So third parties who are authorized to have access to customer information must be required to treat that information in a manner that protects the information and the privacy rights of the consumer, which means limited use of that information. Those vendors cannot use that information for anything, or should not be able to use that anything beyond the exact scope of consent that they have been given. And in addition, no resale or even of aggregated and anonymized data. Both the third parties and the utilities should be responsible for preventing unauthorized disclosure of customer information, and it must be clear, either in statute or rules, who is ultimately responsible. If a customer's data is disclosed, the customer has to know who was supposed to be responsible for that. And if commission rules indicate it, who needs to be penalized for disclosing that information. If it's unclear, then the customer doesn't know who they're supposed to turn to, and it's not really clear who should be in trouble for it. And, Simon shared us a model where it's a trust framework, and he called it a scalable legal framework, but it wasn't clear from his presentation who is actually who's the ultimate entity responsible for that data sharing, even in a larger sort of data across different vendors and different entities. You really need to think about the customer first, not how easy it is to share that data. And then finally, tagging along to the who is responsible, it's that there really needs to be oversight by commissions on a continued basis, and it needs to be clear who is responsible for disclosure. States should adopt rules requiring utilities and others to protect the privacy of customer information. The New York DAF framework is an exciting way or interesting way that states have been addressing this in the most streamlined way possible for vendors, while also protecting consumer rights and privacy. And it would be interesting to see more of that, more states addressing it in a more holistic manner in that way. And I think it's important to remember when drafting rules, it's not just about who shares data with who, but how the customer has ultimate access to their own data, how the customer controls who gets to see that data, and how they can retract that consent to who gets to see that data. And I welcome any comments and questions.
Well, thank you all so much for